Duskbloods will make me pay hundreds of dollars for a piece of plastic which I otherwise would never be interested in. There, I've said it. As of today, we've only gotten one trailer, and one interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki, who's directing the game. However, many relevant details relating to esoteric themes and motifs common to other From Software titles can already be identified, and I think they're enough for us to decipher most of its story, believe it or not. In this video, I will provide my predictions for its story based on these early clues. Notably, Duskbloods bears a strong resemblance to Bloodborne, almost as if it's a spiritual successor of sorts, much like how Dark Souls is to Demon Souls. The game will be about superhuman vampire-like beings fighting for something called the First Blood. Quote, "The game's protagonists, or characters controlled by the player, are known as Bloodsworn. The Bloodsworn are a group whose members have achieved superhuman abilities through the power of special blood. As a general concept, they're similar to vampires." End quote. I believe the First Blood is tied to the idea of the mandate of heaven. It is, essentially, the blood of the God Emperor who sets to rule over the world as an archetypal Antichrist. This God Emperor will become like the vassal, the envoy of an eldritch god, and will be made a powerful, nigh immortal demigod through special blood. Of course, the god in question is not a benevolent entity, but a parasite, a colonizer. His payment will be the collective energy of mankind, their souls. This dynamic is nearly identical to Marika's with the Greater Will, and similar to that of Gwyn and the Sun. The God Emperor is not simply a benevolent ruler. His immortality must be sustained by the vigor of his people. It is parasitic in nature, as is above, so is below. He harvests man's energy for himself like a king taxes his subjects. And, in the macrocosm, the outer god who made him king harvests his. A certain event, called the Twilight of Humanity, is a central plot point of Duskbloods. The twilight is the period after sunset and before sunrise, when the world has become partially illuminated by the sun. The period before the dawn. This event most definitely stands for the end of the previous empire and the rise of a new one. The empire of the previous God Emperor has endured for, most likely, 1,000 or 10,000 years, but is now coming to an end. The mandate of heaven, the God-given right to rule, must be renovated, and the First Blood is, essentially, the fight for that right. A crown must be warranted with strength. The contenders for the throne must prove their worth to the outer gods in a battle royale. Quote, "In the Duskbloods, the Bloodsworn are competing for something known as First Blood. As human society reaches an end, First Blood flows in an event known as the Twilight of Humanity. The Bloodsworn are summoned to the Twilight of Humanity across a variety of different times and places, in a bid to obtain the First Blood." End quote. This Twilight period is equated with the end of human civilization more generally, and is, more notably, tied with celestial phenomena, with the day and night cycle. This is very similar to the plot of Dark Souls, in which the time of day, called the Age of Fire in that series, is equated with humanity's rule of the overworld, with the heyday of human civilization, while the night is equated with the dragons taking over, and humanity having to live confined within the underworld. Having this context in mind, it's already possible to predict two of the game's endings, one of which will consist of a main character inheriting the mandate of heaven and becoming the next God Emperor, calling upon a new dawn for mankind. Another will be the main character rejecting it and banishing the outer gods, granting sovereignty to mankind, but allowing the knights to take over. The cast of characters will mostly consist of Bloodsworn. The Bloodsworn are, essentially, vampires. The name Bloodsworn alone suggests membership in an order bound by a ritual, one that likely involves drinking blood and taking a solemn oath. The Bloodsworn will be akin to royalty, the ruling class being composed of vampires in this world. It makes perfect sense, as the God Emperor is certainly one himself. Esoterically, the soul flows through one's blood, meaning a vampire is someone who drinks the souls of others through their blood to absorb their vitality, their essence. In the context of a magical world like that of Duskbloods, there's likely a mechanism that enables the vampires to transpose the skills of the people whose bloods they've harvested. Perhaps this could translate into special abilities that the characters earn during a match by killing bosses. Perhaps also into a mechanic akin to the transposing kiln from Dark Souls, which enables them to create blood gems that can be equipped in the game's hub area to create different builds. I will now talk about the cast of characters. The mechanics of blood magic will certainly have deeper implications for the lore of Duskbloods, For instance, there's a character that can transform into a dinosaur, meaning he likely consumed, transfused into himself, the blood of that creature through scientific experimentation, through alchemical means. He wields a cane-looking weapon, and his pose and design suggest nobility. There's one character who seems to have been a prisoner, who broke free from his cell. Perhaps he was your typical serial killer vampire, a Bloodsworn who hungered for souls, and turned against his fellow nobles out of drunkenness. Maybe he was a Bloodsworn who went too far, and became a target for the common folk, calling too much attention to himself, a Jack the Ripper kind of figure. He certainly looks a bit loony. Speculating further, and more precisely, this character may have been captured by a vampire hunter organization, but instead of executing, or letting him rot in jail, they offered a deal. They'd allow him to roam freely if he agrees to hunt other vampires, to hunt the targets they designate for him. There's a character who looks like a little boy, but I think he's likely to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest among the cast. He merely became a vampire at an early age, or something like that. He's similar to Master William from Bloodborne, and his casting tool is an eye, representing gnosis, elucidation, and in the trailer, he's the character who's observing the moon god phenomenon, like Willem observes the moon in Bergenworth. Unlike the scientist-looking noble, he's more likely to be a student of sorcery and the cosmos. There's a character who's a cyborg. Perhaps he was the victim of a tragic incident, like an arson which occurs during a vampire hunt. Or he may have been attacked by a particularly violent vampire, and brutally disfigured, having thus been forced to become part machine. If that's the case, he's sure to be a vampire hunter. Perhaps some characters will have grudges against others. There's one character who looks like a Jiangxi, a Chinese zombie vampire. It may be that the empire of the God Emperor, much like Gwyn's, was formed, in part, by an alliance of East and West, that was cemented by a political marriage. There's this man with a huge axe and a mask which covers his eyes. I think he's a hunter specialized in taking down frenzied vampires, like the beastly man we see in the trailer. The pose he strikes seems to be referring to the Twilight. One of his arms points up, the other sideways, as though they're the arms of a clock. Perhaps the main vampire hunter organization, whose members are Bloodsworn themselves, is related to the notion of Twilight, which could symbolize the downfall of the current vampiric empire. He's dressed in white pajamas, a reference to the pale white moonlight. In conjunction with the rest of his design, then, we can infer that the helmet covering his eyes references the darkness of the night, the moon itself. This will be relevant later. There's a noblewoman who looks like Maria and rides a headless horse, a subversion of the headless horseman archetype. She could be a bastard's daughter of someone important, as the character seems to be inspired by the tale of the female headless horsewoman of Welsh folklore. Perhaps the character who seems to be made of gold is a homunculus created by an alchemist to serve as a vampire hunter. He seems to be a long-ranged fighter. His body is frail, but his eyesight is exceedingly sharp. He may have a third eye of sorts, enabling him to see through walls. He'll likely be a glass cannon marksman. Maybe he's just someone who experimented on himself and ended up dull, skeleton-like. There's an Eastern swordsman who wears all black. He's your archetypal Black Knight. He may be an avenger who chose to betray his own class, an assassin who represents the darkness of the night. There's a lady who wields two swords. Perhaps she's a skilled mercenary from the East, or merely another Bloodsworn who hunts Bloodsworns and is part of the hunter organization. And finally, there's a demonic monk from the East, who may have communed with an outer god who granted him his peculiar appearance. Given his presentation, it's likely that he is a satanic subversion of a Buddhist monk, like those of Sekiro. Now, I'll talk about the enemies and bosses we'll face in Duskbloods. But before I do that, allow me to speculate about Duskbloods' plot. There's a formula which the plots of Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Elden Ring follow, which goes like this. An archetypal antichrist, who's always a man, ruins the world, and an adversarial figure, always a woman, plans a conspiracy to save it, though this woman is pragmatic and operates under the logic that the ends justify the means. A witch. The player character acts as her pawn, a useful idiot who punishes sinners, claims their power, and ultimately sacrifices himself. But, alternatively, the player can choose to betray the conspiracy and become the next archetypal antichrist. Bloodborne and even Sekiro follow this formula to a lesser extent. In most cases, an entity equivalent to the agnostic demiurge is driven away from the world as a result of the conspiracy as well. I believe Duskbloods' plot will follow this formula. There may be more than one organization leading the cast. There will likely be at least two, a faction of vampire hunters and a faction of vampires who wish to become the next God Emperor. This rivalry will certainly inform the PvP aspects of the game. Similarly, there may be two different categories of bosses, of objectives, one selection of them for each faction. Either way, one group of bosses will likely consist of Bloodsworn who fell prey to corruption, like the beasts from Bloodborne or the abyssal monsters of Dark Souls. Another may consist of noteworthy vampire hunters. And one group of bosses, which will likely be relegated to the endgame, may consist of eldritch beings and manifestations of outer gods. Lesser enemies may fall into similar categories: mobs of soul-starved vampire hunters, vampires themselves, and eldritch creatures. Perhaps the final boss will be the ruler of the decaying empire, who's gatekeeping the First Blood in a desperate attempt of preventing the end of his rule. Maybe there will be multiple end bosses, in which case one of them will likely be an outer god manifested. In this scene, we see a glass panel which portrays a blood moon, an eclipse, a highly symbolic astronomical event that, in fiction, often signals the coming of the Antichrist, or of great evil, and the man seems to be inheriting its power, the literal blood flowing from it. Below it is a giant basin, a lord vessel-like container. Is some kind of special blood there? Perhaps the first blood itself? Either way, this piece of art is a lore-defining detail. That man may have been the ruler, the king of the previous era, acquiring the first blood and becoming godlike. The blood moon is certainly a ritual during which an outer god was summoned, perhaps through mass sacrifice. Thus, this glass panel likely depicts the origin story of the previous empire. As explained before, we can be sure that this outer god which granted man immortality is not selfless in his motive. It is, or they are, most definitely, a demiurgic figure. And the men who achieve immortality and inhuman strength, the Bloodsworn, are nurturing it.
I give you my blood. I give you my life. Turn, O wheel, and transport him to a night of moonlight, to humanity's very dusk.
It seems that the game's main protagonist has inherited the will of a lady through her self-sacrifice. This lady is dressed in red and asks of the man to transport him to a night of moonlight. Could she be referring to her child? Perhaps to her unborn child? And could her wish be that her heir gets to see this new age and rule it? Or that this protagonist character inherits the right to rule from her blood? From the blood of her unborn child, effectively becoming her legitimate heir? I propose this woman to be the queen, or less likely, a princess. She represents the moon, and wears red to symbolize the blood moon and the first blood, the source of her status. Her husband, the king, or less likely a prince, representing the dark sun. She turned against him, and might even have been the source of his downfall, just as Velko was Gwyn's. She could have poisoned him, contaminated him with impure blood. Either way, she did conspire against him, and wishes for her child to usurp his father's throne. Her child possibly being a bastard and an alchemical rebis, likely under a godless rule. She was the founder of the Vampire Hunter organization, whose purpose was to call upon the knights to end the Bloodsworn Empire, the axe-wielding vampire hunter being one of her agents. The protagonist's hand is scarred with the Sansara, and the woman tells him to turn a wheel. She's asking him to break a cycle of stagnation, to break the false, twisted immortality, to destroy the very Bloodsworn, to make the curse fuel's day end, to bring ruin to her own bloodline, to the lineage of the God Emperor, just like Marika asked of the Tarnished to bring ruin to hers, to slay each and every demigod, and inherits the throne, and proceeds to rule over a godless era, an era free from the influence of the greater will. The Bloodsworn are likely becoming increasingly twisted, corrupted by their fading power. Their era was coming to an end. As the first blood within them rotted, vaporized, or dried up, they thirsted for more, and thus resorted to unsavory means to retain their power and immortality, to preserve the rule over the common people. It was about time that men rebelled. And this is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post in-depth analysis of works of an esoteric nature, ranging from movies to manga to music clips, as well as my insights on philosophy and religion, you can check out my Patreon.